Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to AJ108 Criminal Investigation. My name is Tony Farrar, and of course, I am your instructor for this semester. So, this week's lecture is going to cover Chapter 3, where we are going to look at report writing. And yes, I know it's probably not your favorite subject, but what I hope to instill upon you today is that it is very important, especially as it relates to criminal investigation, that you have a very solid handle on the ability to write reports. So with that said, let's just go ahead and jump into our lecture. We have a lot of ground to cover. Again, like in previous lectures, depending upon how much content I need to cover, I may break it up into two parts, but we'll see how it goes as we start to move through. So here we go. So your chances of being promoted are guided if you can write effective reports. Now, that was even tough for me to read because the spelling was so awful. But I put that in here just to kind of get us thinking about errors, common errors, and things that we find typically wrong that we're going to talk about in our lecture this morning, and to really understand the importance of reports. Again, so I know that technology now, you have spell check and all that cool stuff, but there are still errors that can be made, and hopefully you will understand when we conclude our lecture this morning the overall importance of not just being able to write well, but organization, chronological order, the pathway of your report, and then even the small things like spelling, grammar, and the mechanics of writing a report. So here we go. So one of the most important skills investigators must develop is, in fact, report writing. And while we're going to examine how evidence is located and how it's processed, and how we are, we're going to look at how witnesses and victims and suspects and all those other folks are questioned. At the end of the day, your report is going to capture all the essentials or all of that information regarding an investigation. So I hope that, again, you understand the importance of this particular chapter. Now, Orlando Wilson and Roy McLaren wrote a book titled Police Administration. And yes, it was more than 40 years ago. But you know what? Some of the information in that textbook, it still rings true today. So let's look at a couple of quick excerpts from what was written in that textbook. Well, first, almost everything that a police officer does must be reduced to writing. That is an extremely true statement. So let's continue. What is written is often the determining factor in whether a suspect is arrested in the first place, and if they are arrested, whether he or she is convicted and sentenced. It still holds true today. Even with all the other cool technology, that report is going to really play a huge role in the outcome of your case. Well, let's look at another excerpt. The contents of the written report, in fact, often have great bearing in life and death situations. What if the case that you're working is a capital murder case and that person could receive the death penalty? It truly does ring true, this statement. So to say that officers need to be proficient in report writing is an understatement. And it is, because it's really hard for law enforcement administrators to stress especially on new officers coming into this career path, that report writing is so important because, you know, we learn a lot from watching, you know, or we're influenced a lot, maybe I should say that, by watching movies and TV and things like that, and even talking to people in those career areas. But we don't sit around and talk about, hey, wasn't that a great report that I wrote the other day? We don't really, those aren't things that are discussed. It's the cool stuff. So we don't really see it, so we don't think about it being a really important piece. But it truly, truly is. So with that said, still talking about the importance of reports, we have to at least keep another factor in mind, and that's effective reports. So officers need to be proficient, because a considerable amount of your time, an officer's time, around 20%, and that might vary, is spent writing reports. And poor reporting, as I said earlier, is going to jeopardize criminal prosecution. So consider for a minute what your report might be used for, and the path, the typical path of an investigative report. Now, the number of times your report kind of, you know, loops between the supervisor and the officer, or between the prosecutor and the officer, really depends on how carefully you, the officer, writes that report to begin with. So, you know, let's kind of take a look at the pathway. So it might be a little hard to see on the screen, but you can really look at the pathway here, starting at the top where we take notes in the field and we write the report, and then we proofread the report, and the shift supervisor is going to review it. Now, if they find errors, they're going to send the report back, and this is a typical pathway. And as I just said, it could sit here for a little bit while the supervisor finds corrections, and it could go, you know, back and forth. And then here it could go to the assigning supervisor, again, to review the report, maybe the detective supervisor. And then you can see here, there might be some errors, or the case might get cleared, etc. And then you've got the detective supervisor who might assign the case. It's going to keep on going. And it's going to go down to maybe the prosecutor. And then it's going to go to the court, and then it's going to go to the trial. But look at this chain of individuals. And again, it might stop depending upon what happens here. So look at the prosecutor portion. If your report comes here, maybe it's been okay through all this. It gets here, and the prosecutor might reject it for different reasons. So it's going to come all the way back. And you may have to fix whatever the prosecutor needs and then send it back through again. So it's a tedious process. So, I mean, you know, you have to kind of consider that process as you look at, you know, again, who's going to look at that. So, you know, think about this. If investigative reports were not required for efficient law enforcement, you wouldn't have to write them. So there's a reason for the fact that we need to write these reports, and we need to write them well. So we looked at the typical path, but let's talk about it just a little bit more. So most officers submit their reports for prosecution with concern, but not a lot, about the outcome, but without much thought about the wheels that have started in motion. So they submit it kind of hoping that it's going to get up to the DA and they're going to look at it, but they don't really think about it a lot. And this is understandable because they did their job. You did your job. You responded to the call. You investigated the crime, you found all the evidence, and then you wrote it up and you passed it on, and you kind of think, hey, I did my job, so I'm done. And there's really there are other investigations that have to be done, so I'm going to move on. And that's kind of the typical thought process. But consider this particular thing that I'm going to show you now, okay? Look at this sentence. The weapon was found in the bushes where the suspect had thrown it. Now, think about this. What is wrong with this particular sentence? Well, let me ask you a question. The weapon was found in the bushes where the suspect had thrown it. Who found the weapon? So even the smallest little errors can cause an issue. So the officer in this statement did not really clarify the statement in anywhere else in the report, and so there's a gap. So the prosecuting attorney, as per procedure in this case, would subpoena the officer to testify at the preliminary hearing, because the prosecutor here thinks, oh, the officer that wrote the report must have been the one that found the weapon because it doesn't say anything different. Well, it turns out that the officer's partner saw the action and found the gun, not the officer that wrote the report. So can you see the issue? So even little things can cause these little issues. And it really is going to kind of hang the case up, because now they're going to have to subpoena the other officer to come in and explain that particular officer found the weapon, and not the officer writing the report. And then they're probably going to kind of, question the first officer writing the report on why they didn't specify that. So it just causes issues all the way down. So keep in mind, again, still talking about uses of reports, that reports are permanent records of all important facts in a case. They are considered to be a stockpile of information to be drawn on by individuals, by all individuals on a law enforcement team. They are an aid to not only to the individual officer, but to investigators and supervisors and administrators, the courts, other government agencies, sometimes reporters, and more. So there's more to that. I mean, you can see the uses. So let's look at a couple of these uses of reports, because there are a variety of uses. So first would be by the prosecuting attorneys in preparing the case. The report's going to be, obviously useful for that. By the responding police officer when testifying. You may have to, when you testify in a case, you may have to refresh your memory. So you may have to look at the report. It's going to be used. One use could be by the judge in determining the facts of the case. By the jury, if a trial ends up happening. Your report's going to be read by many different people for many, many different reasons. And if you look on page 78 in your textbook, I mean, reports are used to examine the past, to provide a documented record, to continue the investigation. Maybe you don't have all of your information and you have to work the case for, let's say, a couple of weeks or a month or even a year, to provide the court with relevant facts to, again, refresh a witness's memory about what they said had occurred, to refresh the investigating officer's memory, to plan for future law enforcement services, to even identify hotspots. Did you know that a police report, a copy usually goes to your agency's crime analyst, and when they will put those reports into their GIS system, and they will generate what they call hotspots, where large quantities of criminal activity might take place. So they're used to compile statistics on crime. They're also used to evaluate individual officer and department performance. So, I mean, there's a lot of uses, not just what you see here before you. So again, page 78 will give you kind of a laundry list, if you will. And I threw this in there just to show you that this is, we talked about the technology. A lot of times you're going to write your report in your car because we have the ability to do that now. And of course, you can still come into the station, but most reports aren't handwritten anymore. They are written on a computer, and you type into a template. So if you don't know how to keyboard or type, that's another skill that's pretty important. Okay, so now let's take a look at, so we know kind of what your reports are used for, or used to do, if you will. But now, what would be the audience? Who's going to see those reports? Well, what you write may be read by other officers, your supervisor, lawyers, judges, jurors, social workers, city officials, maybe even insurance adjusters, private investigators, civil rights groups, citizens. Oh, and don't forget the media. So there's a lot of people that are going to take a look at this report. Now, some of the important ones that I talked about, I bold the juries and the media. And all of these, as it relates to audience, are important. But juries, remember, they are the trier of fact. And the facts are going to come from your police report. Or some of the facts will come from your police report. So that's a really important thing to think about. And what you write, the jury is going to judge you based on what you write. They just are. The same with the media. What if a portion of your report got in the hands of the media? So I want you to consider this, because it really is an important thing. Now, keep in mind when you're writing your reports, when you're talking about who's going to look at your reports, this audience, keep in mind that people come from different backgrounds and different fields, who have very different degrees, varying degrees of familiarity with legal terms, or what I term, or what the profession terms, police jargon. And if you don't know what that is, jargon is kind of the shorthand vocabulary and technical terminology specific to a profession. And all professions have it. And law enforcement has it too. And it's not just codes, it's words. So you want to stay away from jargon, and you want to use words that people understand. And that's really an important thing. So, just stay away from that police jargon, or using codes, if you will. So, sticking with our reports, talking about effective reports, let's look at some problems now that we find with ineffective reports. So some common problems with, let's say, reports. So writing effective reports is a skill that must be learned and practiced just like any other skill. So you're not really, I mean, some people just have a knack with writing, but sometimes you have to practice. So it's no different really than other things in police work. So let's say firearm use or self-defense or even interviewing methods. You do have to work at it to get better. So don't get all stressed out if your first couple of reports aren't that good, because they are going to get better as time goes on, as you develop those good skills that you need. Now, keep in mind, sometimes your field training officers may encourage new officers to take some shortcuts or learn some shortcuts. And hopefully they don't do this. But, understand that your job is to, again, take the high road and learn to be an effective report writer. And then also consider that, overtime can occur through thorough and accurate and complex reports. So sometimes even your supervisors may want to kind of hurry you along, if you will. And honestly, sometimes agencies view effective report writing skills. They may not view them as or recognize them as important, but you need to understand that effective report writing is important, and you don't want to be one of those that fall into the trap of someone that really can't write well. So, what are some common problems in police reports? Well, it would include things like confusing or unclear sentences, or using conclusions or assumptions and personal opinions, extreme wordiness and the overuse of abbreviations and, remember, jargon that I talked about, missing or incomplete information, misspelled words, and grammatical errors. That is typically the number one issue that tends to come to light. And then referring to what we call the above information. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but these are some of the issues that we commonly run across in reports that are a little bit problematic, if you will, that are ineffective. So, to write an effective report, first you need to be able to organize your notes and adhere to some basic standards of English, if you will. So the cornerstone of good report writing is, in fact, organization, because good reports, they don't just happen. The writer that writes a good report will plan in advance in what order the information needs to be written in. And too many times officers will come in or they just plop down and they start to write. And that's not really the way that you should do it. You really need to sit down and start to map out your report. So part of that mapping out might first be making what we would like to call an informal outline. And this is where you might list what to include under each outline heading. So in its simplest form, you make some headings and you list those in chronological order, and it will help you to write your report in chronological order. So if your report is somewhat long, for short reports, you don't have to do this. But for longer reports, it is recommended that if you use headings, it'll help guide you, but it also helps guide the reader. So a couple of examples of headings could be initial response, And under that heading, you would know that that's where you're going to put all your initial response stuff. Or crime scene, that could be a heading. And you would talk about stuff at the crime scene. Does that make sense? Or photographs taken. So that helps you, it helps the reader section things off. Okay, he's going to do this now. Okay, he's going to do this now. But it also helps you as the writer. So hopefully that makes sense. So your outline headings might actually look like this, like I'm going to show you. So, and again, you can even use subheadings, but it might be initial response. And that could be where you would write, it might have, let's say, the time, the date, the type of incident, and how you became involved in this. And the next one might be crime scene conditions. So when I arrived at the crime scene, this is what I saw. Photographs taken, the evidence that you located and what you did with it, any witness statements, suspect information, and it could be vehicles involved or witness statements or victim statements, and you could see, but if you use these little headings, this outline, it really helps you formulate your report. So, as the report starts to kind of expand out, and now you're going to start to structure that narrative, the story, in chronological order. Again, it's going to start with, let's say, the opening paragraph might be, here's your example. On June 7th, 2015 at 20:45 hours, I, Officer John Smith, was on patrol in the city of Temecula when I was dispatched to, or I received a radio call to respond to. So again, that would be under your first little heading, initial response. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. And then you expand, and this is how you build the narrative. And you can do it in these increments. When I arrived on scene, I observed, I saw, whatever, etc., etc. So then again, the next paragraph might contain what the victim or witness said. And next you might record what you did. And then the next paragraph states maybe the disposition of the case. And step 2 and 3 might be repeated a couple of different times because you may have talked to 2 or 3 different people. And then you may have done 2 or 3 different things. So just understand that those steps could be repeated. And I apologize for the phone ringing in the background, but hey, I'm recording this at my house and I have a telephone. So there you go. So we talked a little bit about technology, and a lot of times, these are what report forms look like. These are a couple of scanned in forms. And if you were to type into a computer template, the form would actually take shape in the same way. And you would type in and fill in these boxes. So that just gives you an idea of what a report template might look like. So we've talked a little bit about some common problems with police reports. We've looked at the audience. We've looked at how you may want to start to organize and structure your report. I just gave you a little bit of information kind of on what a report form might look like. But now let's start to look at the characteristics of effective reports. So in addition to a well-structured narrative, an effective report exhibits several other characteristics which generally fall into 2 areas. One would be content, which is what is said, and other would be form, which is how it is written. So the effective report writer pays attention to both content and form. So keep in mind the content of an effective report is factual, it's accurate, it's objective, and it's complete. And the form of a well-written report is concise, and clear and grammatically and mechanically correct, and it is written in standard English. So again, and hopefully that clears it up. But a little more, an effective report is also organized into paragraphs. It's not just one long block page. And it is written in past tense using the first person and active voice. Now, depending upon where you work, that could be different. Sometimes departments like to do things differently, but typically you're going to write in the past tense using the first person. All right, and active voice. So again, when you look at content, so when we talk about investigative reports and content, and you compare the content and form, so the elements of the crime, word choice, description of suspects, sentence and paragraph length, evidence collected, and you can see, here's how those two things kind of mesh together. So when we talk about factual, remember I kind of talked about that the content of an effective report needs to be factual and accurate and objective and complete. Well, let's take a little look at factual. So the basic purpose of any investigative report is to record the facts. Now, a fact is a statement that can be proven. Now, it may be false, but it is still classified as a factual statement. The truthfulness or accuracy of facts, we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, but consider how to clearly distinguish between basic types of statements. Okay, so let's look at this example. Fact: the man has a bulge in his black leather jacket. That's a fact. Now, from this fact, what can you draw from that? So we're going to talk about a couple of new terms. So we're going to talk about inference, and then we're going to talk about opinion. So the inference from this fact is that the man might be or is probably carrying a gun. That could be the inference. Now, it doesn't have to be true or not. Remember, and that will be proven later. But the fact of the matter is that this man has a bulge in his black leather jacket. The inference that you might draw from it is that this person might be carrying a gun. The opinion is that black leather jackets are cool. So a well-written report, remember, is factual. It does not contain opinion. And you can discuss and debate facts and inferences logically and reasonably, and to come to some agreement about them. An opinion, however, reflects your personal belief on which there really is seldom an agreement. So, I mean, think about that. So we don't want to have opinionated reports. So another, thing that we talked about, a new word that hopefully you learned was the word inference. So we talked about what a fact is. So let's look at an inference. So inferences or conclusions can prove valuable in a report, provided they are based on sufficient evidence. Now, sometimes it's hard to distinguish between facts and inferences. And one way to tell them apart is to ask the question, can the statement be simply proven true or false? Or do I need other facts to make it possible? So let's look at this example. The man could not walk a straight line. Now, if you were to write that in your report, that would be kind of conclusionary language, right? Do you have enough facts in just that sentence to make it factual? The answer would be no, because how do you know he couldn't walk a straight line? Or how would the reader know? So a more factual way would be to write it like this. All right, the man did not walk a straight line, because maybe you had him do a test. Even better would be the man stepped 18 inches to the right or to the left of the line twice. That shows factually that you saw somebody do something and the person could not walk the straight line. And I'm really hoping that this kind of makes sense, because while it's okay to draw an inference, we have to be careful of using, again, opinion and what we call conclusionary language in a report. So, again, we want to avoid this conclusionary language by showing, kind of, not telling. So there you go. All right, so let's look at a couple of other statements so you can understand what I mean by this conclusionary language, and then we'll move on. So let's look at the first one. He admitted to breaking into the house. So if you wrote that in a report, what would be your question? If I were to write he admitted, even if we were talking a minute ago in this report, a couple of lines ago, about a certain person, if you just wrote he admitted, could you be challenged on that? Because who is the he? Or even more, what does it mean, he admitted? How did he admit it? What did he say? Does that make sense? So you're going to want to have a little more verbose in exactly what the person said. So when you see words like this, indicated, refused, admitted, confessed, denied, what you want to use is a, verbatim or approximate quote of what they said. So you could say he admitted breaking into the house by stating, quote, blah, blah, blah. Or he refused. Well, how did he refuse? He sat down on the curb and told me that he wasn't going to do the test. You see what I mean? And the same with look at words like this: angry, upset, nervous. Now, while these are descriptive words, how does the reader know what upset is? When you're trying to show that? So you're going to have to use specific language. So same here, assaulted, attacked. You're going to need to use a factual account of who did what. So you can see that they're very, very vague in a sense. Because first, you want to know who this is, the he, she, they. But then the more importantly, you're going to want to be able to show, well, how did they admit this? How did they refuse? How did she waive? What did they do to show that they denied? So again, these are important things for us to consider. So that's being factual. So next, let's talk about accurate. So remember, we're talking based on content of a report: factual, accurate, objective, complete. So what about accurate? Well, to be useful, facts need to be accurate. An effective report accurately records the correct time and date, correct names of all persons involved, correct phone numbers and addresses, and exact description of the crime scene, property, vehicles, and suspects. And it's also important that you have people, and I'm going to give you a little bit more before we move on to objective. It's also really important to have people spell their names and repeat the spellings and the numbers. Here, I'll go back to this page while I'm finishing up with this. Have the individuals, again, repeat the spellings or the numbers to verify it. Make sure you recheck measurements. Be sure of the accuracy of your facts. And to be a little bit more accurate, be specific. For example, it's better to say the car was traveling in excess of 90 miles per hour than to say the car was traveling fast, because you can see that it's very vague. It's more accurate to describe a suspect as 6'3" than it is to describe him as tall. So you must have the facts in the case correct. If your report says 4 men were involved in a robbery, but in reality it's 4 men and a woman, your report's going to be inaccurate. So you want to avoid vagueness in your reports. And another common mistake, really quick, is to, often found in police reports, is using the phrase PC for the stop, which refers to probable cause. Because probable cause is required only for an arrest or a search. The standard required by the Fourth Amendment for a stop or a detention is a lesser threshold of reasonable suspicion. So police officers who write about the PC for the stop, they kind of feed into the confusion, the legal standards that may already be cloudy to the jury. So you want to make sure that you're factual in all of your information. So again, accurate. To be useful, facts must be accurate. And then objective. So you have seen that reports must be factual. Is it possible, however, to include only factual statements in a report and still not be objective? So what does this mean? Well, being objective means being non-opinionated or fair and impartial. And lack of objectivity can result from either two things: poor word choice, or actually leaving out facts or omitting facts. So, keep that in mind too. So you want to make sure that, and an example could be this. I'll give you kind of an example really quick, and then we'll move on to complete. The woman cried, or the woman wept. Those are really two different statements. Crying, wept, kind of, you draw an inference that it's she wept. It's at a higher level, if you will, and the person's like distraught. And cried would just be kind of like simple crying. So you can see there's a little bit of a difference. So just understand, being objective in your reports is important. And then finally, being, complete and even concise. So information kept in the reporting officer's head really is of no value to anyone else involved in the case, because if you don't write it down, so it's important that you get there. So what officers write in their report stays with them forever. Now, conversely, if something is not documented in the report, the defense attorney can and probably will argue that it never happened because you didn't write it down. So consequently, every report should be a complete account of the details of an event. So, and think about it like this. When it comes to writing police reports, officers should always strive to document all injuries, they receive during any incident, even if it's a minor injury, record any unusual statements germane to the event, and explain why the officers took certain actions, particularly with respect to use of force, especially now. So it's important to remember the who, the what, the when, the where, the how, and the why when you're conducting your investigation, and make sure that all of this information gets in there. So, and some of this might require a little bit of inference. We understand that. And when this occurs, when this is the case, label the statements if you need to as inferences. And this is especially true when answering the question of cause. So you don't want to, again, be over opinionated, but you might be able to draw an inference based on a set of facts. I believe that this may have occurred, and you can do that. So next would be being concise. So while you want to be complete, you still want to be concise. And concise means making every word count without leaving out important facts. So you want to avoid wordiness. Length alone does not ensure quality. So some reports can be written on a couple of pages, while others might require 12 or even 20. Yeah, I know, I don't want to scare you. There's no really specific length that's prescribed to a report, but strive to include all relevant information in as few words as possible. So you can reduce wordiness in a couple of ways. One would be to leave out unnecessary information, and two would be to use as few words as possible and to record the necessary facts. So let's give you an example. The car was blue in color. Now, could you reduce this down? Think about it in your head as we're talking. Could you actually make this a little bit shorter? Well, you could. How about the car was blue? Why do you need to put in color in there? And I see this frequently in newer officers when they write, I already know that blue is a color, so you don't have to tell me. And most people know this as well. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. So this is the rationale for concise. And here's a couple of other examples. And officers tend to use a couple of these. Made a note of the fact that. Well, if you wanted to be concise, you could use the word noted. Same with like the blue in color, square in shape. I already know that a square is a shape. In the amount of 4. Despite the fact that, and officers use this all the time. How about although? And you'll get better at this, so trust me. For the purpose of determining. How about to determine? So these are more natural sounding alternatives for these wordy phrases that law enforcement officers, when they're new, tend to use. All right, so the final list that was in that, as we talked about characteristics of effective reports, we'll talk about clear. So making sure that our investigation is clear. So an investigation report or an investigative report should have only one interpretation. 2 people should be able to read that report and come up with the same word picture and understanding of what happened. And that would mean that the report is very, very clear. So, on page 87 in your textbook is a table that also I threw this in there to help you with artificial sounding versus natural sounding words. to help you with the wordiness and to try to make things clear. So again, a lot of times we try to use these cool words: initiated, commenced, inaugurated. How about began? Altercation, physical confrontation is a fight. And these are just suggestions. You don't have to use all of these, but I'm throwing in some suggestions. So when we talk about clear, okay, and I'm going to stay here for just a second, there are some things that I want to just kind of hit on briefly. Follow these guidelines, if you will, to help make your reports a little bit clearer. 1, use specific and concrete facts and details. 2, keep descriptive words and phrases as close to possible as the words they describe. 3, use diagrams and sketches to help when a description is really complex. Because maybe it might take you 3 pages to describe some big crime scene, but if you used a sketch, you might be able to cut down on that. Next, if a witness or victim has provided any written information, make sure it is clear and understood. Next, do not use uncommon abbreviations. Stay away from the jargon. Remember, we talked a little bit about that. Don't make stuff up. All right? And then finally, use short sentences that are well organized in paragraphs. It's easier to read. Don't have that big 1-page narrative because that's really, really tough to follow. Does that kind of make sense? And in a little bit, I'll show you a couple of examples on what that big 1-page thing might look like. So, a couple of other characteristics of effective reports would be grammatically correct. You know what? We're probably at about the 50-minute mark. So why don't we do this? I don't have a lot more to cover, but I don't want to just jump right through it. So let's stop here quickly. Let's take a quick break, and we'll come back for part 2. So this is going to conclude part 1 of chapter 3, writing effective reports, and we'll come back for part 2 in just a couple of minutes.